For the first step in prepping our arms to get bolted onto the unit, we'll take our sway bar end link that we previously removed with our OEM suspension, and we'll bolt it to the lower arm using our factory hardware. You'll tighten it up with an 18mm socket and wrench. For the next step, we'll go ahead and install our lower A-arm into the frame using our OEM hardware. When lining up the bolts for the lower control arm, it may help to use an alignment spade or a screwdriver to help get the bushing collars lined up with the holes in the frame. Once you get the bolt started, you can simply tap it in before capping it off with a nut on the back side. Moving on to the next step, we're going to hold off tightening everything up until we get everything started. With your lower arm loosely installed, you can move on to installing your upper arm. Just as the lower arm, we'll use our OEM hardware to fasten it to the frame. You'll install it into the frame tabs before sliding your bolts through the holes and then moving on. On this installation, since we're using our TF Elite ball joints, you'll have to grind some of the material out on the lower portion of the knuckle using either a pencil grinder or a carbide bit. I've went ahead and marked the material we plan to remove here with a silver Sharpie to make it easy to see. Once you get it all clearanced out, you can go ahead and move forward with mounting the arms. With our knuckle adequately clearanced for our TF Elite lower ball joints, we can move on to mounting the arms to the vehicle for mounting our knuckle, and then finally our rotor and tie rod. With your upper arm loosely installed, we can move on to fastening the knuckle to the lower ball joint. You'll slide it over the tapered pin and slide the axle through the center bore of the knuckle before capping it off with your OEM lock nut and moving on to the upper ball joint. For the next step, we'll loosely install our upper ball joint into the knuckle using our OEM cross bolt. Once you get the ball joint into the knuckle, you can install your cross bolt and flange nylon lock nut. Once you have your cross bolt through for your upper ball joint, you can go ahead and tighten that up before moving on to tightening your lower ball joint, and then we'll move on to the hub. Before we move on to tightening our lower ball joint, we'll go ahead and install the hub by sliding it over our CV axle into the wheel bearing and capping it off with our thick washer and our castle nut. We'll tighten it up using our 30mm socket before installing the cotter pin and moving on. We went ahead and installed our cotter pin to keep our axle nut from backing off, and we can go ahead and install our rotor onto the hub before moving on to tightening up our lower ball joint. You can tighten up your lower ball joint using an 18mm socket. You may need to use a flathead screwdriver or a similar pry bar to fully seat the lower pin into the knuckle to keep it from spinning. With your lower ball joint tight, we can move on to bolting the shock to your upper control arm on the shock mount. We'll use our OEM hardware to get everything tightened up. We can go ahead and tighten up our shock mounting bolt using our 18mm socket and wrench. For the next step, we'll fasten our tie rod to the knuckle. On this installation, we're using our Thumper Fab welded tie rod. So this will have a steering pin, a misalignment, and a heim. You'll take the lock nut off the bottom of the steering pin, installing the tapered point of the steering pin into the knuckle before capping it back off with your lock nut on the underside. Similar to the lower ball joint, you may need to hold down and squeeze the pin so that it fully seats inside the knuckle to be able to tighten the pin up before moving on and tightening your upper nut. With our tie rod tight, we can move on to mounting our brake caliper. You'll use your OEM hardware, and if you're running our TF Elite ball joints, you'll have to grind on your rock guard or optionally remove it. For us to determine where we'll need to grind, I'm going to loosely install the caliper to the knuckle and then mark it before taking it off and grinding. We'll go ahead and slightly snug our caliper up to get a better understanding of exactly where our contact region would be so that we don't remove any excess material. So what I'm going to do is mark here to give me a representation of how much material I need to remove before using our pencil grinder and an aluminum carbide bit to remove the material. We'll use an 8mm socket to remove the two bolts that fasten the rock guard to to the caliper anchor before taking it over and grinding off the excess material that we don't need. We'll use our aluminum carbide bit to remove the material that's marked here on our rock guard before smoothing it up and reinstalling it on the vehicle. The only thing left to do is set the vehicle on the ground, roll it back and forth a few times before setting your toe and hitting the trails.